I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
And together we are the History Boys. Every week we look at an era or an issue, a personality or a movement that made up the pathway to where we are today, because if you don't know how you got here, you sure won't be able to work out how to get out of this mess. It's been quite a year, Adam Gary, and we are going to review 2018. What were the highlights and lowlights for you, Adam?
Well, there were plenty of both, and as I've said, this year, 2018, was a Dickensian year, insofar as for some it was the best of times, and for others it was the worst of times. Being the pessimist that I'm not, I'm going to start with the best of news, and this was Korea, a peace process that I strongly believe is irreversible. In the late 80s, people were saying that what was going on in Eastern Europe, in the former East Germany, in Hungary, it was going to just be a fad that was going to fizzle out. And they were proved wrong. The Berlin Wall fell down and the Germans had to suffer with the free David Hasselhoff concert just to prove how irreversible that situation is. Google it for the people who don't remember. It was quite extraordinary, to put it diplomatically. But for Korea, peoples who share history, share language, share culture, share traditions, share a history of brutal occupation from Japan that began long before even the invasion of China. This began in 1910, the Japanese occupation of Korea. And even though Korea has been free since the 1950s, one could argue that about the South and its relationship with the US in its early days, but there have been two autonomous Korean states, but nevertheless a divided Korean people. When one thinks that the US and its allies dropped more bombs on the north of Korea in the 1950s than were dropped by all sides combined in the Second World War.
Staggering.
People were reduced to digging in dirt and eating worms because of the level of destruction. And tense relations, therefore, developed between a divided Korea from 1953 up to the beginning of this year. But it's very apposite for a year in review to begin with the New Year's Day of 2018, because it was then that Kim Jong-un, the chairman of the DPRK, North Korea, extended an olive branch in his speech to his people that was also directed to all Koreans, both in his DPRK and in South Korea. He said that the time for reconciliation is now. And the fact that, unlike his predecessor, Park Chung-hee, Moon Jae-in, as president of South Korea, was a moderate, was peace-minded, did have the ability to clench that olive branch in a spirit of optimism, we've now seen the two leaders of the two Korean states embrace each other on the demilitarized zone, which ironically, up until now, was the most militarized zone in human history. But to share that embrace and hold one another's hand, they walked into a future that there is no going back from. And what's more is that where previous peace processes had a strong foreign influence, while of course the United States has a lot to say and hopefully not much more to do in the Korean peace process, and while China and Russia, I believe, are both playing a constructive role and indeed both have positive relations with both Pyongyang and Seoul, this really was a Korean-owned, authored and executed peace process. We've already seen the cessation of hostilities in the region. We've seen them demining the DMZ. We've seen joint patrols from North and South Korean soldiers in the area. We now see South Korea and its partners working to invest in creating a rail link between the north of North Korea and Seoul. This really is an irreversible trend. And the reason I say that is because both Korean leaders and the majority of Korean people on both sides of the divide are well aware of this historic moment that needs to be seized or else forever lost.
Well, that's a brilliant summary of, and a great subject to choose to kick off the review, not least because it began on New Year's Day.
Indeed.
Of 2018. I have myself been to North Korea a couple of times. I've visited the demilitarized zone, as you say, the most heavily militarized zone imaginable. But there on the DMZ, you can get a sense of what the division has meant. For example, the North Korean soldiers are rather thin, rather small, and not quite as beautifully uniformed as the southern soldiers, who are very much taller, very much fatter, and glowing with Americana, if you like.
Yes.
And I made the point back then that North Korea is like preserved in aspic, the actual Korean culture and language and behavior, etiquette, and so on, whilst the South has been gang-banged by Americana. To what extent has one or both been ruined by the division? Will they be able, organically at some point, to become one people again?
I think the answer to that is the one country, two systems model that China has used to reintegrate formerly British-occupied Hong Kong and formerly Portuguese-occupied Macau back into the People's Republic of China, and done so successfully, no matter how much the British-style South China Morning Post likes to shriek the antithesis of this reality. I think a similar model with Korean characteristics is the way forward, and the other reason that I have a lot of hope is that while, as you say, the problem with the South is that it's been gangbanged by this Americana, for the North it's been economic isolation. And Kim Jong-un is a young man, far wiser than many of his detractors have anticipated, and some of the statements he's made about revitalizing an automated North Korean industry, pioneering artificial intelligence, doing the things China is pioneering, makes me realize that Kim isn't going to shake Uncle Sam's hand in the way that Saddam did in the 80s or Gaddafi did in the early 2000s. Far from it. Kim is going to do to his country, and he's already begun doing it, albeit at a small, comparatively small and gradual level. He's going to adopt the market socialist model whose 40th anniversary China has been celebrating throughout the year. And in fact, China just posthumously bestowed a medal of friendship to Lee Kuan Yew, a man we've discussed frequently, whose style of reform in Singapore inspired the Deng Xiaoping reforms of 1978. Just as China has been celebrating this auspicious and very positive anniversary, I believe that Kim is going to go down that route. He's not going to make the mistakes of Gorbachev and Yakovlev. He's going to look to Deng. He's going to look to President Xi, who he's become a very close friend with after having a rocky beginning to their non-relationship. And that's the future of the North, and I believe the future of the South is one of a more restrained Americana. Nothing changes overnight, but Moon in particular has improved relations greatly with China. Economically, they were already going quite well. He's taken it a step further by addressing China's concerns about the US militarization of the region. He's enhanced relations with Russia. He's continuing great relations with an ever more independent ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. So I think the future of a united Korea is positive on this one country, two systems model, and I think that in the North in particular, a move towards market socialism, and in the South, a move towards multipolarity, hinting at non-alignment, is going to be the future of a peaceful Korea.
Staying in Asia, your friend and mine, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad, Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad is now has now made history, already had made history many times, but yes, he's now the oldest elected leader in the history of the world. Tell us.
Well, his comeback was something that was quite extraordinary. It was Mahathir who changed Malaysia by transforming the economy, borrowing not a bit, more than a bit from what Lee did in the former united part of Malaysia, which then became independent, Singapore. Mahathir, though, understands his people. He's got a pulse on the complex multiracial dynamics of the country. He understands both the good and the harm that's come from the new economic policy of affirmative action. He's become one of the great champions of the Ummah in the region, meaning the wider Islamic cause that isn't too frequently discussed in relation to Southeast Asia, but which ought to be, not least because nearby Indonesia, I believe, is the largest Muslim country in the world in terms of population. And so Mahathir is really, he's come back at a time when ASEAN itself is being put on the map and making history for the historic dialogue process that has been enhanced this year between the collective members of ASEAN and China over the South China Sea, what would have been a non-dispute, but one which the US has tried to weaponize to the point of war. ASEAN has been pulling back, and as one of the leaders of a multi-aligned, non-aligned, call it what you will, Southeast Asian state, the re-arrival of Mahathir, who was 92 at the time he won his election, he's now 93, he shows no signs of slowing down, and I think that's been positive for Malaysia, positive for the region.
Staying in Asia, South Asia this time, the dynastic to and fro or pendulum that had previously existed in Pakistani politics, the Sharif family and the Bhutto family, has, for now at least, been interrupted. We have a new prime minister there too. Tell us.
Well, I believe that Imran Khan's peaceful election victory was nothing short of the most peaceful revolution that Pakistan has ever had. This period of Bhutto, coup, Sharif, Bhutto, another coup, Sharif, Bhutto, this cycle of dynastic, corrupt politics, interrupted by military rule, interrupted by foreign exploitation, war, terrorist invasion, friendly fire where Pakistani civilians are slaughtered by the drones of Bush and Obama and their henchmen. This era has ended insofar as the voters drew a very firm line under the sand. It's no coincidence that Imran's PTI supporters call this revolution Naya Pakistan, New Pakistan. And while elements of the increasingly cynical mainstream media in Pakistan try to underplay this victory, from an outside perspective, I honestly have to think, what's wrong with these people? This is a moment where the Pakistani voters have made history. There's a prime minister who cares, a prime minister who has no dynastic baggage attached, a prime minister who's not in it for the money because he made the money and turned his back on that kind of lavish lifestyle. I'm a true believer in Imran Khan's political program and in his own ability to deliver much more of it than people are giving him credit for. Already, he stood up to the US in a more articulate manner than any of his predecessors had even tried. He said that his state is sovereign. We've suffered by being subservient to the US, especially after 2001, but also before. And as a result, Donald Trump, he like most bullies, if you want to call them that, which in respect of Pakistan he certainly is, he respects strength. And you wrote about this in your book on Street Fighting Years, about how to overcome bullies. And Imran, he may well have read the book, but he certainly has ascertained the meaning. He stood up to Trump, and then Trump wrote him a letter almost begging for Islamabad's help in bringing some sort of finality to the quagmire in Afghanistan next door. If that alone isn't a success, I don't know what is. And frankly, you ain't seen nothing yet if you're in Pakistan. It's a good time to be optimistic for Pakistanis.
Well, as you mention it, and as we come to the end of 2018, peace talks are now officially underway in the UAE. Between what's called the government in Kabul, whose writ doesn't seem to stretch much beyond the congestion charge area of downtown Kabul, and the Taliban, the former government, who were overthrown by Western invasion in 2001. How's that going to work out in your view?
It's going to be a long process, and in many ways it already has, but the fact that Taliban representatives and representatives of this Kabul government are even sitting together is an important step. I think Imran in particular has articulated Pakistan's long-held position more forcefully and more clearly than anyone else. And that is a position that is shared by China, by Iran, surprisingly to some, by Russia, perhaps more surprisingly to some. And this position is that the only peace process that will work is an all-parties peace process, meaning you can't just jettison the Taliban, not least because by some accounts they control over 68% of Afghan territory. You need to have an all-parties process, and you need to do it within the framework of the US withdrawing sooner rather than later. That's obviously going to be the most difficult part of the process, but if all parties do sit at the table, and if they do so with respect, if they don't shun Pakistan's involvement, if Iran is brought in out from the cold, if Russia and China remain united, as I'm 99.999% sure they will on this issue and many others, there is at least some hope. The US is finding itself in a Vietnam-style situation, but instead of meeting with fierce Viet Cong-style resistance, it's the same outcome, but after years of blood-soaked stalemate.
Now, India is the elephant in the room in this discussion
so to speak, yes.
So far. It's a peculiar situation in India, isn't it? The government there on the international level has good relations with Russia, not so good with China, not as good as one would expect with the United States, but internally extremely repressive. Repressive in Kashmir, repressive towards the Sikh people, presiding over the most reactionary, hyper-Hindu political revival, people being murdered, suspected of eating cows, which most of the world does, and indeed India exports cows for other people to
eat.
There are so many paradoxes wrapped up in the enigma that is the current Indian political dispensation. Give us your, steer us through that.
Well, a lot of people tend to brush off the serious issues going on in India because they say, oh, India's always been an enigma. Look at its history. Look at its regional differences, its religious differences, its linguistic and ethnic differences. I'm sorry, but that's not good enough. This current government of Narendra Modi and his radical Hindutva BJ party, the BJP, and its associated paramilitary gang of thugs, RSS, they have taken sectarian violence, which was hinted at in Gujarat, where Narendra Modi was the regional
chief minister.
Indeed, in the early 2000s, there was a slaughter in 2002. This mentality has been brought to a national level, and I honestly believe that if Nehru, the founder of a secular, tolerant India, with problems but with hope and optimism, if he were to see what Modi has done, I have a feeling he would weep. Because the violence that Muslims are facing, the rape of children, that is a mark of insane madness that it leaves one speechless. But when it's done on a sectarian basis, when you have members of the ruling party that go to the courts to cheer the perpetrators rather than to march for the victims, when you have Sikhs finding in Indian Punjab that they're being repressed, when you have Kashmiris suffering after 70 years of political repression that's only getting worse under national BJP rule, you have one of the largest countries in the world with immense economic potential, and it gets a pass. The sad thing is that while BDS rightly supports the rights of Palestinians, and while media organizations in Turkey, in Iran, in Malaysia, throughout parts of Africa do shine the spotlight on Palestine, quite unlike the Western analogues, Kashmir is an issue that outside of certain Pakistani media circles is forgotten, but the plight of Kashmiris is no less severe than that of Palestinians. At times it's been worse.
It has been worse, and it mirrors it in many, many ways. You mentioned Nehru, though. His dynasty continues, and the children, now grandchildren of Mrs. Gandhi, his daughter, are still ruling the opposition party, the Congress party. How is that going to work? Is that going to work? Is there a real national opposition to Modi in India?
A month ago, I would have said probably not. That's changed because there have been recent state elections, effectively regional elections, where the BJP got a sizable bloody nose from Congress and from smaller opposition parties. And because Modi has been the sort of titanic figure in Indian politics, some of his scandals have been catching up with him. And Congress and its other allies, it's trying to build a broader coalition, they may stand a chance in next year's elections. I'll put it this way, where if a month ago you were to say who's going to win in 2019 in the Indian general elections, I would have said, sadly, the BJP. Now we have something approaching a real contest. Rahul Gandhi, the progeny of Indira Gandhi, obviously leading the Congress party. He's been accused of being an uncharismatic figure, where in India, Modi is quite charismatic, even if he doesn't necessarily come off that way outside of India. But we have got a contest now in 2019, and I personally hope that the BJP's iron grip does loosen, if nothing more.
Now, just because of time, let me race through some of the other big theatres in the world. You cannot avoid the elephant, another elephant in the room, of Donald Trump. Do you predict that he'll still be the President of the United States this time next year?
I do, and it's because presidential systems are very different than parliamentary systems. In a parliamentary system, Donald Trump would have had a lot in common with Theresa May. They don't have a lot in common on a personal level. The man who enjoys concubines from Playboy and the uncharismatic daughter of a vicar. But if Donald Trump was in a parliamentary system, his back would be up against the wall, much like Theresa May's is in Britain. But in a presidential system, whether in the US or France, there's not a lot you can do to remove a president from power. And here's the shocking thing. The same coalition that voted for Trump in 2016 are vocally behind him. So long as he doesn't get impeached before 2020, which I think is quite unlikely, in spite of what shouts and shrieks one might hear, I think that unless he's going up against Mr. or Miss Charisma, he's going to win in 2020. So let alone survive 2019.
And Macron, whom you mentioned, will he still be there this time, next year?
Well, a vote of no... The French have a weird system that's sort of the worst of both worlds. To declare my interests, I campaign for parliamentary change. In the Philippines, I want them to shift from a presidential system to a parliamentary. France has this hybrid system where you can have votes of no confidence in the assembly, but one, they're very infrequent. There's only been one successful one ever, and that itself was cut off before it had a chance to make any impact. That was in 1962 against the Gaullist Prime Minister Pompidou, who later became a president in his own right. I think that Macron isn't going to be removed because legally it's almost impossible to remove him, even harder than removing Donald Trump. But the other side of that coin is, I think, the street protests in France that are now, I think, in their 5th week, possibly the 6th by the time you see this. I think those are going to continue into 2019. I think they're going to get bigger, and I think that other parts of Europe are going to experience similar agitations.
Macron dégagé, or... as French TV had it, when they removed the word dégagé.
They would have thought it was some sort of enthusiastic rally.
Macron. At least they didn't insert long live Macron. Finally then, back to Blighty, back to London. It's an exciting time on one level, a bit of a perplexing one on another in Britain. We have a government that is in office but not really in power. We have a collective cabinet responsibility ethos in our country which has entirely broken down. The British cabinet are all issuing entirely different and separate plans for the future. The Prime Minister is literally running from the prospect of no confidence. The Europeans say they're no longer interested in negotiating with us. Mrs. May claims that she's still talking, though to whom, about what, in this parliamentary democracy we are not able to know. The opposition party, the Labour Party, is really two parties, at the very least. It's a long time since Britain has looked so utterly dysfunctional, don't you think?
Well, for the country that's supposed to have what by international standards is sometimes called the least interesting politics in Europe, Brexit is really where the penny dropped for all of Europe. The wheels of motion, the wheels that were set in motion in 2016 when Britain defied the mainstream media, defied the experts, defied the mainstream politicians, defied Barack Obama, who meddled in Brexit. Putin didn't, Obama did, let us never forget. That's when these wheels wheels in motion started, and now they're driving forward into a brick wall. Not because Brexit doesn't remain popular. I'm convinced that Brexit is, if anything, more popular than in 2016, in the same way that Trump's base in the US, while they're not on the camera, they're certainly there. But what you have is a political crisis of confidence, a political crisis of national identity. You have all these mixed crises going on within political parties that on all sides of the British House of Commons should frankly be broken up. There should be a Jacob Rees-Mogg Brexit party on the Tory side, and there should be a pro-Remain side, much as Thatcher was a Remainer, a pro-Europeanist for most of her life. Likewise, the Labour Party should have its Blairite wing merge with the Liberal Democrats, and then Jeremy Corbyn should lead a proper leftist Labour Party.
And if we had proportional representation, that would be, ironically, a very European political spectrum.
Indeed. Indeed, very much so. So I think if it was the best of times for Korea, very good times for China, in spite of what some say, very good times for Pakistan's inspirational election, good times for Southeast Asia in general, with the elder statesman Mahathir's return being emblematic of that, for Europe, it really has been the worst of times. You have a French president who can't be removed, that nobody wants. You have a Brexit deal which very few understand, even fewer can articulate, and a prime minister who's unable to negotiate, attempting to negotiate with an EU that doesn't want to negotiate any longer. You have a real disconnect between people and politics in Europe at a time where in Asia things are becoming more connected, with the exception of India, but even then next year this election might rectify it. So the countries that once colonized the world, that once sowed fear into the world, which tried and succeeded to economically dominate the world, and which spoke down to the world about every subject imaginable, from democracy to human rights to civil society, Europe, if the political class doesn't get its act together, is more likely to experience prolonged civil strife than any other region in the world, except perhaps for Chad and the Central African Republic. Now, the people in France...
That's a comparison that will be uncomfortable for many European viewers.
Certainly, Macron and May come from backgrounds of wanting to dominate some of Africa's least stable states, but Europe is on the verge of crisis.
The empire strikes back.
And I'll put it, indeed, and I'll put it this way: unless some sensible, rational, realistic-minded European politician or group of politicians arises to light the gas lamp of sanity, you're going to see the torches of extremism march throughout the streets of Europe. I don't want to see that. I want to see a rational conclusion where people's justifiable anger is listened to, but I fear that if that doesn't happen, things will get worse before they get better.
Adam Gary, it's been a pleasure working with you in 2018. I hope we continue to do in 2019 what we've done in part of 2018, which is to show people how we got here. And your peerless historical knowledge and wonderful eloquence has lit up the Christmas tree for me. Thanks very much indeed.
It's been my pleasure.
I've been George Galloway.
I've been Adam Gary.
We've been the History Boys. Have a nice holiday.